right, folks. I hear we have a half an hour and we have a lot of things to cover here, so I'm going to jump right in. The topic here is credit risk and rescheduling. And we've heard a lot today about rescheduling and how it may or may not impact the ability for the industry to get capital. And I thought this morning it was really interesting. Frank Colombo from Veridian had said rescheduling is more fundamentally important than any of the legislative initiatives since it directly impacts cash flows. That may be true. However, there's a lot more to think about other than cash flow and profitability, and that's what we're going to talk through here today. So, Joe, I'm going to start with you, and I'm wondering if you can give us your thoughts around how rescheduling might reduce risk and therefore reduce cost of capital.
Yeah, sure, of course. So, Applies Capital is a full-service debt marketplace, so we deal with about 100 different lenders in cannabis, including banks. So from our perspective, really, rescheduling will definitely help, like Frank said earlier, to the bottom line, right? It will help from a 280E perspective so that they can take advantage of certain write-offs, and it will help certain operators that weren't profitable become profitable and qualify for, a term loan or something that they traditionally wouldn't qualify for at that time. But, really from a lending perspective, the same lenders will also still be in the space, and it's still going to be a state-by-state game, and it's also still going to be private lenders like AFC and other lenders here that are going to be deploying the majority of the capital in cannabis. You'll still have certain operators that will be qualified for banks, but I don't think that so many banks will be rushing into the industry to start lending. But you definitely will see, much more eyes on the industry when that does happen, and it will take time. Over time, more lenders will step into the space, and hopefully the cost of capital will go down along with that.
Is the more lenders entering the space the primary reason that the cost of capital goes down, or is there a risk component to that?
I mean, either way, to get a cheap cost of capital like a bank loan at 10, 11% at this moment, you have to be a very profitable business. Mm-hmm. You also have to have assets for them to be able to lean, real estate in particular. You also have to move your entire deposit relationship to them as well. They want to know that they have full control over the business. And that's available today, right? So rescheduling isn't going to change that. There may be more banks that will step into the space, but it'll all depend on what the Fed rate is and how that gradually goes down over time as well.
Okay, great. And Dan, do you agree with that perspective? Do you think that there will be more lenders? Is there anything you would like to add around the credit risk and pricing?
Yeah, so Dan Neville, CEO of AFC Gamma, we're a institutional lender into the cannabis space. I think that overall, right, rescheduling is a credit positive. Going from being taxed on gross profit to being able to deduct normal SG&A interest expense and be taxed on pre-tax profit is more cash flow to the overall operation. However, I think that looking at the cannabis space today, there's not broad generalizations. There's obviously companies that have different capital stacks, but generally there's a lot of leverage in the system. You typically have 2 turns through some sort of debt, a turn or 2 of sale leasebacks. There may be seller financing on top of that, and then there's tax debt that's building every day with every transaction pre-rescheduling. And that's all, those tones of leverage are all post-rescheduling, right? Because EBITDA is pre-tax expense. So as we look at the industry today, I think there's a decent amount of leverage, and some companies can grow into it. There were obviously business positive events like Florida flipping to adult use, other adult use flips on the horizon, but it's still a federally illegal business. with a decent amount of leverage in the system and an emerging business overall. And so I think that limits the number of institutional providers of capital that are out there. And to be frank, some of the providers of capital in 2021 and 2022 vintages had a pretty rough time in states like California, Colorado, and elsewhere. And so we're actually seeing today that some of the providers of capital from those vintages are actually exiting the cannabis markets. A couple bigger funds in the space are in wind down mode. And so while there will be some banks that come in, there will be some institutional capital that comes in on the margin. I'd agree with Joe that it's a gradual process that will occur over time, and the industry needs to continue to perform for the cost of capital to really start to move down in any significant way.
That's great. Sahar, one of the things that we talked about earlier was around the ability to secure the loan, the collateralization, and the impact rescheduling might have around that, bankruptcy, and that sort of thing. So if you could talk to us a little bit about how you think rescheduling will impact those areas of the credit risk.
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking to you guys as the attorney, which means that the stance I'm going to be taking is a yes, but kind of stance. So when it comes to any kind of lender financing, you cannot have a loan without having collateral. It just is not possible. When you think about collateral in cannabis, obviously depending on where you are, one of the most valuable assets you have as collateral is your license. I think it's important to remember that even when you have rescheduling taking place, that's not going to completely override the state-by-state regulatory structure that exists. That state-by-state regulatory structure will continue to exist, which means that you will have certain states that have unlimited licenses, you will have certain states that have limited licenses, thereby affecting the value of the license as collateral. You're also going to have to think about, okay, the state that I'm going to be putting a loan into, the operator that I'm going to be providing a loan to, is the license even something that can be collateralized? If so, what does it mean for that collateral to exist? Am I going to have to be disclosed to the regulators? If I'm going to have to be disclosed to the regulators, what level of disclosure am I going to be subject to? And do I and everyone in my group feel comfortable with that level of disclosure? When you also think about that collateral, you have to think about what happens if you need to go in and collect on that collateral. And you're still going to have to think about the applicable state regulations, even in the instance of rescheduling, which means that you may not be able to go in and take control of the collateral overnight like you may be able to with, say, real estate or something that's not as heavily regulated. So these realities, I think, are still going to be something really important to keep in mind as we think about what lending looks like after rescheduling takes place.
I think one of the things I'm curious about is, right now we know that cannabis operators can't take advantage of the bankruptcy ruling. And I would imagine that once they move into Schedule 3, if that's the direction it goes, that there may be more ability for them to go into receivership and work through those pieces.
I think it'll be something that is going to definitely be worth exploring. I don't think it's going to be a surefire kind of thing that happens where it's like immediately, yes, bankruptcy is just wholly available to the industry without question. So if you are a lender or if you are a borrower thinking about borrowing post rescheduling, I would not rely on that as the ultimate safety latch that's going to be automatically available. I would still think about strategizing around it.
Yeah, and I would echo that as if you're a borrower that's waiting for rescheduling to look for your capital raise, you know, there's going to be no difference if whenever it happens, you know, it'll still be the same. You'll still have the same people. And the people that really understand cannabis are the people who survive in this industry and lend to good operators.
And I would add that while Schedule 3 might not open up bankruptcy for us, it does open up offers in compromise with the IRS. And the biggest debt out there is tax debt. And that there were no offers in compromise before rescheduling. And that's a big, big, big opportunity for cannabis companies with tax debt to find out a way to pay it off in an organized way and emerge on the other side without that tax debt. So that's a big deal that will change with rescheduling.
That's really interesting because I've heard that some cannabis companies will intentionally withhold their tax payments because it's 18% penalty with the IRS versus 20% on going to get capital to keep them going. So they would rather pay the 18% on the money. I would imagine that practice would change.
What happens a lot is that people limp along for a while and they generate past tax debts. And they're always a little behind, right? They're always like, okay, we'll get 2019 paid off this year. Well, guess what? You already have suffered all the penalties on 2019. The interest rate is half of what you could borrow for, right? So that is an often trap that people get stuck in, not realizing that they should not pay those past due debts. And what they should do is get current now, right now in this year, which means making an estimated tax payment and not paying your past liabilities. And because of where we are right now in 2024, you probably can't get current in 2024. So if I'm your lawyer, I'm going to tell you don't pay anything right now. Let's get into 2025. We'll make a first quarter estimated tax payment in 2025. Now you're current, and now you can get what you owed from the past into a payment plan, or perhaps even in another status called currently not collectible, where the IRS just says, we'll talk to you next year. So there are a lot of avenues that deal with tax debt, and a lot of times people just don't understand that, and they end up trying to do the responsible thing, but really hurting themselves because they're paying liabilities that they may not have to pay ultimately if they follow this other plan.
I always jokingly say that the IRS is the biggest lender in cannabis.
Yeah.
That's the truth, though.
I did some back of the napkin math one day based on the number of sales, and it's something like $18 billion they're collecting in tax revenue. So that sounds like money laundering to me.
They're not collecting it, they're assessing it.
Good point. So question for you, Nick. Because you deal with accounting and taxes and all of that, you had mentioned something during our initial call that the profitability expectation isn't probably as likely as or dramatic as people think. You want to expand on a little bit around how this may or may not impact profitability?
Yeah, I mean, first off, a number of companies are already using methods to drastically reduce their 280E burden. So that is already in a lot of companies out there already. It could well be that we already don't have 280E anymore. It may have disappeared when the HHS issued their report in August of 2023. That might be the end of 280E. We don't know yet. I say might be, but that there's a good argument that 280E went away last year. And if it did go away last year, I wonder, what does rescheduling do for us in that situation, right? If what I keep hearing is 280E, 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 and I'd like to know what else happens in rescheduling that's good for the industry, because maybe 280E already went away, right? I think that's an interesting question for our banker friends, right?
Why do you think the IRS put out a bulletin in June of this year saying that 280 exists and is still due until rescheduling is a final rule, and reinforced that at a tax conference a few weeks ago?
Right. I was there. Yeah. So let me just say this. First off, it really doesn't matter. Let me just say this. It really doesn't matter what the IRS says. It really doesn't. They can say they can say whatever they want, and it doesn't make it the law, right? And this year we had the overruling of Chevron, which really makes it not the law, right? So we don't really care what the IRS says. What we care is, what are the courts saying? And what the courts are saying, and I know that Verano was up here earlier, and there was a little talk about that. What the courts are saying is that the basis of the industry's fight is, quote, persuasive. That came out within the same week of the IRS's statement that amended returns were wrong. And it's very simple. I mean, and we got to look very closely at what they said. They said amended returns, right? So that's 2020 and earlier. Why didn't they say anything about 23? I felt that was a pretty glaring absence in that announcement, right? Particularly with all these new developments that we have in 23 that, have real merit to them in an argument that 280E doesn't apply. Why didn't they say, oh, and don't take that position in 23 either? They didn't.
So Dan, I think what you were trying to say was sort of like the IRS is reinforcing that 280E is still very much in place until rescheduling happens. And that's sort of contrary, I think, to what you're saying, Nick, is you're thinking that it may have already sort of lost its power.
There's two fights going on. The fight that the IRS is talking about is a fight that's in the courts right now that's based upon a case called Gonzalez v. Resch. That case and that fight got a lot of people's attention. And I was an IRS trial attorney for 12 years. When that announcement came out, we called up our friends at the IRS and said, "What's going on, guys?" And they said, "Nick, we have received tens of thousands of amended returns." Tens of thousands. They called it a tidal wave of amended returns, right? So a lot of companies have just done it on their own and just decided, look, if it's good for Trulieve, it's good for me, right? And I'm going to file that amended return and ask for those dollars back. And of course, that woke the IRS up, right? And they made a statement about it. Make no mistake about it. Gonzalez v. Resch is still binding law. The IRS is bound by it, right? They have to follow the law. It hasn't been overturned yet, but there's a real chance that it could be. And companies should be looking to protect their ability to benefit should that come true.
I just, typically on personal taxes, you don't want to be a choir boy. You also don't want to be crazy, because you open yourself up to an audit, you put your head out, you could get in some big trouble. And I think not paying 280E taxes on a go-forward basis, certainly a reasonable position to take.
It's probably
But
a credit
filing-
risk, right?
Well, that's what I was going to
filing,
say.
filing amended returns, and now there's probably a couple big companies, potentially more, that are undergoing reviews from the IRS because of these amended returns, puts you at significant risk, because it's all fun and games until the IRS files a tax lien. And once that tax lien is in place, that primes any potential refinancing that a company could do down the line. And there's a wall of maturities in 2025 and 2026 that could have serious issues if an IRS tax lien goes on these businesses.
Or worse, you had a levy that empties their accounts, their bank accounts.
You can get financing if you have an IRS lien. There's a whole process for it, but the IRS is at the table with their hand
If
out.
you're on a payment plan,
Yeah.
you got to be on a payment plan.
They got to get paid, right?
If you're not on a payment plan, you're not getting financing.
It strikes me as like there's this crazy guy over in the corner with a knife that is pretty dangerous, and like you're gonna go up to him and yell and scream at him and hope that you don't get stabbed. Like that that seems a little dangerous to me, to be running a business that way.
I agree. So let's bring this back to credit risk, although we did sort of make that turn back here at the end. One of the other things that we've been talking about a little bit is how these businesses might restructure. If we look at rescheduling typically applies to medical use products. So there's the whole question around the adult use market and whether or not, and this is, Sahar, Nick, do you foresee that there is restructuring that happens where businesses that are currently doing both somehow split themselves up, or some other holding company structure that allows them to take advantage of rescheduling and the downstream tax benefits, or do you think folks will be able to sort of sit where they're at?
Want me to take that?
Sure. There's been a lot of structures that have been set up to try to minimize and get around 280E. Those don't work. If you've got one of those, they don't work. So I think rescheduling gives us an opportunity to kind of right-size our entity structure in a way. I see entity structures that, you know, are 5 pages long, right? And that's just a nightmare. Just reading the entity structure is a nightmare, right? So I think there's an opportunity to get more sort of traditional sort of structures from companies and, you know, get out of that, simplify your situation and get a moving forward vehicle that is much more business friendly.
I'd agree with that. One of the things I would add to that is also I would not advise an immediate overnight restructuring to take place as soon as rescheduling comes through. I think it's important to also take a beat, wait and see what your own state regulators say, and then also understand the government's attitude around restructuring, the IRS's attitude around restructuring. Take that in and restructure in a way that also still makes sense for your own operations. You don't want to restructure in a manner that takes you away from what may have been working for you just to run towards something new. I think it's something that has to be done very, very patiently, and upon taking in both advice from, you know, council, tax advisors and whatnot, as well as the input both from a state and federal level.
Yeah, because I would imagine a restructure of your business is obviously it's going to change how your balance sheet present when you're looking for capital.
I mean, from our perspective, you know, most lenders want you to have that real estate entity that owns the real estate, and then the operational entity that owns the license and the operation. And from a credit perspective, they're still going to want it that way.
All right. So, you know, from an overall perspective, we've got, you know, just over 5 minutes left. I'd love to hear from each of you sort of an overall summary of what you think rescheduling, is it the panacea that everybody's waiting for? Is it a step in the right direction? Is it going to make things worse? What are your thoughts?
For us and Upwise, it's definitely a step in the right direction. It's not the golden goose that everybody thinks it's going to be. It's not like Bank of America is going to step into lending to cannabis as soon as rescheduling happens, but I definitely think over time, you know, more lenders will step into the space and start getting intrigued by the space, and we'll start to put out more capital. So it's definitely good for the industry as a whole, but like a lot of people said, we just need to show growth and show, you know, certain states aren't going to be completely compressed, and, you know, it'll always be a state-by-state game until federal legalization comes.
I tend to agree. I think it's very much a step in the right direction. I don't think it's the magical end-all, be-all. I think it's going to make strides as far as the normalization of cannabis as an industry, which in turn is going to help in a myriad of ways. But I think it's important to remember that you're still going to be the same operator that you were before rescheduling, after rescheduling. Rescheduling is not going to fix your operational issues that you're responsible for. You can't look to rescheduling to fix issues that stem from you and from your company. I think it's important to remember that this is a path forward, but this is not a fix for what needs to be taken care of internally and on an ongoing basis by every single company.
And before you take your turn there, Joe, I want to just kind of dig into something you just said when you talked about, you know, you're the same company and you're still, you know, running your business. What about the effect of potential competition from big pharma? Because once it becomes rescheduled, they're likely to get into the industry. Does that change the landscape in terms of profitability and credit risk and all of that?
You're going to have, if and when operators like Big Pharma get in, you're going to now have far, far better backed competition who also has general experience running a business on a level that most cannabis operators just do not, both in terms of size and longevity. And it's also important to remember that you as an operator, especially if you've been operating well in this very particular regulated type of market, have hands-on experience spanning years, knowing how to survive and to exist, which itself is incredibly valuable. And I think that once operators like that start to get into the industry, I personally wouldn't look at them as just pure competition. I think a long-term operator looks at that as, yes, competition, and also perhaps there's a way to work with them and to make that work for me.
Dan?
Yeah, I think it's a big step forward for the industry and long overdue. It's a, idiotic policy for cannabis to be the only industry and legitimate industry that's creating a lot of jobs in this country to be taxed on gross profit. I don't think it's the panacea in terms of leading to uplisting or other things like that. Capital markets access is probably the other second or maybe even the first big issue that the industry is facing, and I don't think this solves that. But it's more progress than we made in the last decade at the federal level, and so hopefully it's a step to more down the line. I think in terms of competition, I think maybe over a longer term horizon, others get in. I'd bet on, alcohol as opposed to pharma or cigarettes coming in, just as consumption trends shift from alcohol over to cannabis. And that's something we're seeing consistently in the US for a few years, and it started to spread to international markets. So I think that's the likely entrant, but having spent 5 years on the operating side of things before coming over to AFC on the lending side of things, I don't see the pharma or the alcohol execs driving out to the middle of nowhere, Illinois, to these cannabis grows. I think, it's probably buy versus build from that perspective.
Nick, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. I think it is late coming. I think that's we all think it's a step in the right direction, but it is late coming. It's a small step, I think. It doesn't do anything to help the legacy operators that are carrying huge debt, and that was what we recognized. In the AHHS report was that the 2016 denial was wrong, right? It was based on the wrong test, right? And so it does nothing to seek to fix that problem. And I know that there's a lot of people that are trying to use that to address that problem, and maybe there'll be some success there come December 2nd when there's a testimony in Washington, D.C. We'll see, right? But yeah, definitely a step in the right direction. Hopefully not the first step, right? Hopefully, or not the only step. Hopefully just the first step.
All right. Well, with 50 seconds to spare, if anyone has a quick question, I think we could probably entertain that. Otherwise, I would suggest that you catch up with these wonderful panelists during the event to say hello and ask any additional questions.
How can we reach Nick? He's a plant.
Are you in the...
Yeah, you come up and talk to me. I'll talk to you.
Are all of you in the Benzinga app if folks were looking for you?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. There's your answer. All right, folks.